This isn't a short and simple video. There are caveats, calculations, and best of all, secret tech. This guide also assumes you know how Bunny works and you're towards the end game. Proceed with caution. I was holding out on a Bunny build guide in the hopes that the developers would address issues with endgame polarity and being able to completely optimize your character for multiple types of content. Sadly, this hasn't materialized, and based on the director's comments in the latest patch notes, we likely aren't going to see this addressed for quite some time. As a result, I've decided to push out my first real guide for a character. Begrudgingly, it's not maximally polarityed for any type of content, but it's almost completely optimized for what I tend to use Bunny for the most: farming content as quickly as possible. If you want Bunny as an all-rounder that includes Colossus farming, this isn't the guide for you. The polarities we're using won't align well with being a boss killer. We'd want to invest heavily into crit for that, and we simply cannot with the modules that we want to run to clear other content as quickly as possible. I want to stress that I'm open to feedback and recommendations on anything that I do. I'm agnostic as to how a maximally efficient Bunny is achieved, so long as it's backed with decent reasoning or some evidence. I think I've covered all the bases here, but if you have any feedback, tricks, tips, or secret tech that you think I don't know about, leave a comment. Good faith analysis is always welcomed. With all of that out of the way, let's first look at a fun module setup: Infinite Sprint with MP. You can achieve this with complete investment into skill cost reduction, MP recovery, and max MP. The skill cost reduction is where we're getting most of the juice from. With Narcissism at full stacks, we can reduce our skill cost by 87.6% from modules alone. You can include a reactor to push this to 91.6%. We'll recover MP during our sprinting with this setup if we're at full stacks of Narcissism. The only real use for this right now is running around and gathering resources. You'll lose MP very gradually because you have to stop sprinting to gather the resources, but it's more than sufficient to loot an entire area before that actually becomes an issue. Now let's talk about clearing content. I want to stress there are a few versions of this, one that requires more active engagement and another that requires less brain power and very little button clicking. Let's talk about the active engagement version first. The build I'm using takes full advantage of Electric Condenser's increased sprint speed buff. You'll get an extra 20% sprint speed for the duration of the ability, and this ability's duration can be increased. By default, it's just over a 1 second wind-up time, followed by 5 seconds of the buff. Depending on our exact setup and what content we're clearing, we can increase the buff's duration to 9.3 seconds. We can reduce the cooldown to 9.5 seconds in the same setup, and since it takes 1 second to cast, this is an infinite duration with a recast every 10 seconds. The following module setup is optimized for clearing normal content. In most instances, this is just going to be for infiltrations. An example of using this setup would be clearing the shelter to gather Pattern 17 Mutant AA for Luna's enhanced cells. If we're going to be a sweaty gamer trying to get world record speedruns, this is the setup we'd most likely use. As we progress into hard mode content, we're going to need to up our damage. We can switch in quality of life in the form of more mana access if that's needed. It's going to depend on exactly what we're farming. If you're trying to plug and play without much switching or thinking, this is the module setup that I think most people are going to be most comfortable with. We take additional skill cost reduction instead of duration here. This is mainly for infiltrations that are running simulators. If we're clearing emissions such as Abandoned Refinery Unit in Echo Swamp, Abandoned Zone, we can switch in skill duration instead. Since we're proccing MP Collector and picking up so many MP orbs anyway, we're never really in danger of running out. We'll also make use of the near 2000 skill power multiplier Electric Condense gives us to clear this annoying pack at the chicane before the elite room. Note this particular mission likely has better pathing for a quicker clear speed. I'm just showing how this build works in practice. If you're struggling in any particular piece of content with mana upkeep, you can ditch MP conversion, chuck Strong Mentality in its polarity slot, and run Selective Recovery or Enlightenment. This is a big hit to our Electric Condense cooldown, and I've never found a time when I've needed to do this, but it might be something that you want to play with in some scenarios. Note that the main switch that we're making from normal mode to hard mode is bringing in Focus on Singular and adding HP amplification. Since changing modules and infiltrations now isn't possible, we're going to want to run HP amplification. We could have played around with something else if we could switch just before the boss room, but alas, that's not currently possible. If you're less interested in actively using Electric Condense, that's totally fine. It's still a huge nuke, so you can just save it for elites. In this case, we'd probably want to switch out cooldown for Subjuration instead. This way, we don't need to recast Lightning Emission that often either. This is a great lazy build with very little adjustments required from my recommendations. In most content that I've cleared, anything that's not an elite dies quickly enough for us to not require any more damage, so we don't need to sacrifice any of the utility that we have for more damage. And now for some secret tech. On top of the extra 20% sprint we get from Electric Condense, we can further amplify all of our movement speed by an extra 10% with Brisk Walk procs on our weapon. The on hit in its description applies to skills too, although if we one-shot anything, it doesn't proc, except if we one-shot barrels and resource boxes. These count as hitting. Note that there's a general ammo version of Brisk Walk, as well as a special rounds version. The buff is the same, but they don't share the same cooldown. If you have both of these versions on Brisk Walk with the same cooldown duration, please let me know if they still have independent cooldowns. The same module type in a different weapon shares the cooldown, but if you have a different module level with the same ammo type, it doesn't share the cooldown. Let me be a little clearer. If I have a general rounds weapon with a maximized Brisk Walk that has a 15-second cooldown, a specialized round weapon with a 16-second cooldown, and a second general rounds weapon with a 17-second cooldown Brisk Walk, I can cycle through all of these weapons one by one and proc Brisk Walk one after the other. I'd like to know if I can increase my special rounds weapon to a maximized version, and then my second general rounds up to a 16-second cooldown without losing this functionality. This only really matters if I'm chasing world record speedruns, but it would be good information to have anyway. Now, I'm not going to suggest that you should rotate between 3 weapons every 5 seconds for a movement speed buff. Over many hours of gameplay, that's just not going to work. However, I do think it's worth having a maximized Brisk Walk in a Millennium Frost pistol for clearing most, if not all, content. Every so often, you'll get a 10% movement speed buff, and if you need to kill the boss at the end of an infiltration, you can just switch to Thunder Cage. Sadly, I'm posting this video after the bunny farm at White Knight Gulch has been rotated out. I'm sorry for this, but I had to do a lot of research and respecking for this build. Your BIS reactor for active, regular uses of Electric Condense will be a purple reactor with any sub condition, but duration and cooldown as the 2 sub roles. I believe that even with a minimally rolled reactor, we can achieve infinite uptime on Electric Condense. Mine only has blue duration and purple cooldown, but it works just fine. As for the sub condition, pistol or submachine gun are optimal since we're probably running Thunder Cage or Millennium Frost, but if you get a whack weapon requirement, just fulfill it with your 3rd slot. I also have a Thunder Cage version of this reactor that I might use in an area that has particularly difficult monsters to kill since it gives us a little bit more damage. We can run Brisk Walk in the Thunder Cage instead of Millennium Frost. Millennium Frost's advantage over Thunder Cage is incredibly marginal, but I will explain why after I discuss external components. Right now, set bonuses in the First Ascendant aren't really that great. The only real notable one would be the Supernova set, which gives us more damage in exchange for far less survivability if we go for all 4 pieces. I'm not a fan of these glass cannon setups. You tend to sacrifice defense for unnecessary damage or utility, and I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. If you can get the memory and processor from the Annihilation set, these are probably best in slot. But let's talk about the mods we actually want in order. Firstly, Abyss Auxiliary Power would be a max HP base with max HP and MP recovery out of combat as secondary stats. We could switch in Kuiper Shard drop rate for MP recovery if we were farming something like Abandoned Refinery Zone. Abyss Support Sensor would be a HP base with max MP and MP recovery in combat as secondary stats. Note that I don't have a HP base with these 2 stats, but the Def base is a close second, so this isn't a huge sacrifice to make. Abyss Memory would be Supernova with its Def base and MP recovery modifier with a secondary Def roll. The MP recovery modifier is the most important stat here. Abyss Processor would be Supernova with its Def base and basically any substats. In theory, you'd want resistance and shield for optimal survivability, but you can run equipment drop rate here when farming instead if you want. You really won't die much on this build. Note that the MP recovery modifier applies to MP orbs, MP collector, MP recovery in combat, and MP recovery out of combat. If you're having trouble sustaining sprint, this is likely your issue, or you're running a support sensor without MP, which is a major no-no. We need the additional MP not only as a storage tank, but because it increases the amount that we get from MP collector procs and MP orbs. Millennium Frost has a very small advantage over Thunder Cage because of its base movement speed of 675 over Cage's 600. When we cast Electric Condense, we'll spend just over 1 second in our walking animation, and I found absolutely no way to remove this impedance. If you can find a way to cancel this animation, please let me know. It would make this build feel so much better. I need to do more testing, but that will be in a tech video that I'll do later down the road. What What I will say is that it feels as if the momentum you have when jumping isn't removed when casting Electric Condense, so casting it during this is probably the best time. Additionally, I went down the bunny hopping rabbit hole, puns intended, and discovered that you'll proc your lightning emission more frequently if you're jumping. This is a straight DPS upgrade, although requires more active involvement, which some might not like. The numbers equal around 9% more frequent procs. In case this isn't implied, I'll also explicitly state that the benefit of more movement speed on Bunny isn't just getting from point A to point B quicker, it's also more frequent procs on Electric Condense, which equals more damage. I also want to mention that you should absolutely be using your grappling hook. When done correctly, it's even quicker than running with Electric Condense up, although only by a fraction based on my testing. It might even be edged out by Electric Condense with Brisk Walk Up, but the way the game handles lightning emission procs when you're in the zipline seems to behave differently than when you're sprinting or in your jumping animation. This is something I'll research at some point, but my hunch is that the First Ascendant doesn't vectorize movement when you're using your grappling hook, and instead just calculates raw changes in your XYZ coordinates. This is why it procs more frequently than it probably should. We're too invested in speed utility to make this a viable boss killer in the absolute sense, though I can see a potential setup with Bunny that utilizes Electric Condense and pivots into critical hits for some crazy damage. This requires completely different polarity, and it's only theoretical, but something like this might be a fun Colossus option to consider if you've already beaten the game. In theory, we can get our Condense cooldown to 5.3 seconds with modules, reactors, and external components. With better weapon buffs or number changes down the line, this could actually materialize into a build. For most people, casting Electric Condense on cooldown isn't going to be that enjoyable, but this build still functions just fine as a way to get infinite sprint without having to use bionic fuel. This build is also completely default Bunny friendly. Electric Condense isn't an Ultimate Bunny exclusive. In some scenarios, high voltage might be preferable, especially if you have multiple bunnies running it, but this polarity setup doesn't handicap you in any way. You can still put in high voltage and the build functions just fine. I think on the margins, Electric Condense would win out every time in terms of speed, but there might be some niche scenarios where that's not true. This build seems perfectly optimized to complete all non-Colossus content, but if you think a particular type of farm is better achieved via other means, please let me know in the comments. Again, I'm completely agnostic as to how you can clear content as efficiently as possible on Bunny. All I care about is finding the optimal setup. I think this is it. My major problem with this setup is the 1 second cast time on Electric Condense. I'm going to petition Nexon to remove this, and the build will feel so much more buttery if they do. Chances are slim, but if you're an employee of Nexon watching this, I will love you eternally if you allow us to cast Electric Condense without getting kicked out of Sprint. The camera FOV switch and speed reduction feel bad, and even though it nets out to a movement speed boost, the disruption might make a few people reluctant to play this particular version of Bunny. Thanks for watching. I'll have a pinned comment if anything new comes along. Remember to subscribe for more TFT content in the future.